Other lectures, questions may be submitted via Facebook or through the link bit.ly/stmlectures. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Dr. Detos Villanueva for our Catholic Faculty Series, Life as a Scholar and Believer. Dr. Villanueva and her husband and children have been part of the STM community for many years. Her undergraduate degree is from Harvard and her medical degree from Washington University. She's an associate professor of medicine and director of the HIV/AIDS program at the Yale School of Medicine. I'll let you tell her story and how she lives out her faith as a Catholic and as a doctor. However, there is something that makes her story incredibly personal to the STM community. As many of you know, someone from our staff had one of the earliest cases of COVID in Connecticut. Dr. Villanueva was one of their caretakers, and they remarked, "She is simply wonderful." With that, I welcome Dr. Villanueva.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to share my story in this Catholic Faculty Series. While I have become quite used to the Zoom format in my day-to-day life, it still feels really different to do a night of intimate sharing where I just cannot see my friends and family at STM. Nonetheless, I still consider myself fortunate to have a chance to connect with you all, albeit virtually. Since I cannot see you, I have no idea what my audience is. Maybe just a few of you, or many of you. Maybe I'm catching you at dinner time. Whatever the case may be, I imagine my audience to be the wonderfully diverse group of STM followers, students, of course, faculty of all different backgrounds, fellow parishioners who, like me, miss the 10 a.m. Mass and Bernie's amazing brunches, our STM chaplains, and our staff. Perhaps there are some medical students or undergrads considering a career in the medical field for whom I hope my experiences might be of interest. So a little bit of background. Sister Jen sent me some prep questions to guide my reflections. So I was born in the Philippines and immigrated to the United States with my family when I was 4 years old. Both of my parents worked at the University of the Philippines, and we moved to New York City, where my father had a job at the United Nations. I grew up in Queens, in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. In fact, I was only one of 2 non-Jewish kids in my elementary school, and I always thought that Christians were the minority religion. My Catholic upbringing was pretty traditional, probably strongly shaped by the experiences of many immigrant Catholics. Catholicism is, of course, very dominant in the Philippines and very much a part of everyday life. My family went to church every Sunday, went to confessions regularly, took part in the sacraments of First Communion, confirmation, we lit votive candles, and I even remember as a little girl wearing a veil pre-Vatican II. My church experience growing up was a very joyous one, filled with active participation in our community. We had a very memorable group of Augustinians at our church, which was called St. Nicholas of Tolentine, and they really valued community involvement at a time when this was perhaps less of the norm. I remember being part of the choir with my mother, playing the organ. My sister would play the flute. My brother played the trumpet during these grand liturgical celebrations at Christmas and Easter. Our church community was racially and ethnically diverse, and I remember how sustaining this was. I carried this faith tradition with me after I left home because I felt that being part of a church community was always a home away from home, a familiar and constant presence as I journeyed through college, medical school, and beyond. I graduated from Harvard in 1981, and I went to Washington University Medical School in St. Louis. My undergraduate concentration was in biochemistry, but I always was interested in subjects outside of STEM, languages, literature, music. My decision to enter medical school was, in retrospect, not born out of a single-minded devotion to becoming a doctor since I was a child, but really in part a practical decision that was influenced by my immigrant roots. My parents always drummed into me and my siblings that we should enroll in something that would lead to a solid livelihood. So my sister's a cardiologist, and my brother works in IT, but at a hospital. This is still very much a part of the immigrant work ethic. Work hard, succeed, improve over your parents' circumstances. I see this story in so many talented students that I interview for in the internal medicine residency or for fellowship. So just to round out the resume, after medical school, I did a residency in internal medicine at Duke University, and then I specialized in infectious disease, or ID, with my fellowship at Yale. I left the, quote, ivory tower, unquote, to work at Waterbury Hospital, a community hospital in Connecticut, which was then the home of the Yale Primary Care Residency Program. My experience there as chief of ID allowed me to thrive personally and professionally. I became involved in developing a Ryan White-funded program for persons with HIV and AIDS, and I met my husband, Peter Ellis, who is also a member of STM, and he actually got me to join the STM community. I then rejoined the full-time faculty at Yale about 10 years ago as the director of the HIV/AIDS program. For those of you outside of the medical field, you may wonder, so what does an ID specialist do anyway? Well, on the clinical side, we are asked to consult on a wide array of patients, both inpatients and outpatients. Such patients have infections of all types, pneumonia, skin infections, brain infections, among others. Of course, you can foresee that the scope of infectious diseases also extends to new infections that plague mankind. For example, HIV, our first cases were in 1981, and SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID-19. As scholars within Yale Medical School, we also study infectious diseases, both on a basic science level, but also, as in my own case, within the realm of public health and improving healthcare outcomes. So life takes many twists and turns, and although my initial decision to enter medicine may have been shaped by practical concerns, as my personal narrative played out, I realized that being in medicine was so much more than this. And this is where my faith life intersects with my career. In a larger sense, as my nearly 30-year career has evolved, I realize how fragile we all are. It doesn't matter how old or young, rich or poor, politically inclined, racially or ethnically based, intellectually gifted, etc., we are all vulnerable in our own ways. I guess as I've gotten older, I've increasingly begun to understand that it is through our faith that we all have the means, the grace, to raise one another up. So in the remainder of my reflections tonight, I want to talk about two themes that I see as illustrative of how faith informs my work. The first theme is that every person has an inherent dignity in the eyes of God. And the second theme is God offers us the gift of hope in the face of uncertainty. So first about inherent dignity. I was always struck by stories of Jesus healing the lepers. Leprosy is an infectious disease, right? I was also fascinated by those lepers in that Ben-Hur movie way back when. They were hiding in the shadows. I said, what is up with these lepers? They really fascinated me. And so now I'm going to quote Luke 5, quote, "While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, 'Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean.' Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. 'I am willing,' he said. 'Be clean.' And immediately the leprosy left him." Wow, Jesus is a role model for doctors, and maybe you can say he was the first infectious disease doctor. But I was struck by the fact that he said, I am willing. And then he touched the man. So willing to do what? Touch someone who society had rejected. How hard is that to do? Pretty hard, but something that doctors are confronted with all the time. So let me give you an example. And doctors always give the examples of case history, so I will take up that tradition. So, about a month ago, I took over the care of a woman who was transferred to Yale for heart valve surgery. She had a really sad saga. She had badly controlled diabetes, which led her to have foot infections and eventually a leg amputation. These infections had spread to her heart, and she ended up needing to have her mitral valve replaced with an artificial valve in a very tough surgery. She survived all of this and then decided to drive up north to live with her sister in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, she encountered these COVID restrictions, so she was not able to enter Massachusetts, and she got stuck in Connecticut. She developed yet another foot infection, requiring more toe amputations and antibiotics, and she was recuperating in a campground. Unfortunately, while there, she ended up having another infection, this time on her prosthetic or artificial mitral valve. Unfortunately, it was so immense that it spread to her adjacent valve, or the aortic valve. She was then transferred to a higher level of care at Yale New Haven Hospital because difficult cardiothoracic surgeries are performed here at Yale. She was really a medical mess, and given how complicated her medical situation was, it was not too surprising when the surgeon said, after 2 weeks in the hospital, she's not a surgical candidate. So when I first met this patient, she was in dire shape. She was lying in bed, looking frail. She looked more like an 80-year-old, even though she was only 50 years old. By this time, she had suffered a large stroke, leaving her paralyzed in her right arm and with speech difficulties, making it hard to understand her. Both her mitral valve and her aortic valve were leaking, and she was having trouble breathing due to heart failure. On exam, she was hard to understand because of her stroke. She was disheveled. She had an amputation on her left leg, and her remaining toes on her right foot looked pretty bad. She was also paralyzed on the right side. I pulled up a bedside stool and started a conversation. I did not know anything about the person beyond the patient at this point. The chart did not really give me any clues, so we chatted. Once she got going, her speech actually became easier to understand. She told me that she was from down south. She had been an artist of sorts, but times got bad. Her first husband left her for another woman. Her only son abandoned her too. She kept trying to make a life, and she remarried, but her second husband would not stay because she had so many complications from her diabetes. She lived in a trailer park until she got too sick to stay. She got strong enough for a time, and she decided to drive north to make her new life for herself in Massachusetts. And now here she was in a hospital in Connecticut on our ward, and she wanted to know what was going on. I told her, your heart valves are doing poorly, and your heart cannot pump well. You're in heart failure. She asked, how can we fix that? I said, you need surgery with new valves. But the surgery is going to be complicated. I don't know if the surgeons feel like you can make it through. She asked, if I don't have the surgery, will I die? I said, I want to be perfectly honest with you. Can you take it? She nodded, yes. You will die without the surgery. I just don't know when. You could also die during or after surgery. She thought long and hard, and then she said, can I still get better even with my stroke? Shall I even pursue the surgery? I said, People can get better after strokes with rehabilitation, but it's going to be a long road ahead. She said, "So if I don't get the surgery, I will certainly die. If I get the surgery, I may still die, but I may also have a chance, right?" I said, "You got it right." She said, "I want to take that chance. I want the surgery." So I went back to talk to the cardiothoracic surgeons. As I suspected, the procedure would be very challenging. The surgery was one that was pioneered at the Mayo Clinic, many hours long, very high mortality. But then the surgeon said something that made me stop. He said, "We looked at everything that happened, including the stroke. We felt that the quality of her life was poor, so that surgery would not be in her best interest. Plus, when we asked the patient, she said she wasn't interested in the surgery." So, how physicians frame things to patients matters a lot. I told the surgeon that I had had a long talk with the patient, who was still relatively young, and that she fully understood the stakes that were involved. She felt that she still had a life to lead, even with her stroke. I asked him, would he reconsider? In fact, research shows that physicians often underestimate the quality of life experienced by so-called disabled patients. And by the way, how do we even judge the quality of a person's life? Eventually, after several second opinions from other surgeons, the patient was taken to surgery for the complex commando procedure, as it was called. She actually did survive the surgery, but unfortunately, in the end, she did succumb to many infectious complications. I believe, however, that her wishes had been taken into account. Her dignity was considered, and I felt like I played a role in upholding and recognizing her dignity. That's where faith and career intersect. I like to think that, I'll give you her name, Gina, that's her name, felt like her voice was heard, that her doctors were willing, and that they reached their hands and they touched her. So what does it mean to be willing? This comes from a place of compassion, empathy, and humility. Physicians have a duty to advocate for their patients. As was said in Matthew 25, "Whatsoever you do to the least of my brethren, that you do unto me." Let me turn to the second theme, which is about hope in the face of uncertainty. That too is informed by my faith. At my advanced age, I have lived through 2 serious viral epidemics in my career. The first was HIV, which was recognized in 1981 when I was just beginning medical school. I remember rotating through the wards where the ICU was filled with dying patients with pneumocystis pneumonia. We didn't know how to treat it at the time. We were just flying by the seat of our pants. So in my early career, I went to way too many funerals of my patients who died in the absence of adequate medical therapies. Our mantra was to treat and cure where we can and comfort when we can't. So AIDS was the leprosy of the 80s and the 90s. And believe me, the medical profession was not always giving. In many places, doctors refused to take care of AIDS patients back in the day. I was fortunate enough and attracted to the work of my ID mentors, many of whom I've had the privilege of learning from. And now, over 30 years later, while we still do not have a cure for HIV/AIDS, we have many effective, convenient, well-tolerated therapies that have made HIV/AIDS a treatable, chronic disease where the life expectancy can be close to normal under the best of circumstances. So, fast forward to 2020, March 2020, precisely when at Yale New Haven Hospital we saw our first case of COVID-19. As Sister Jen referred to, this was a person near and dear to our STM community. This patient, my patient, was on my ward. I'm sure you've all seen pictures in the media of our wards, particularly New York City and other places where the cases ballooned. The ICUs were packed, healthcare workers running out of PPE. We had no experience with this brand new disease, no known therapies. Frightened? Panicked? To say the least. Those of us in healthcare have been hailed as heroes, but what really is the reality? So I'm going to shift gears here just to make it real to you, like what we do on the wards, and I want to show you how we don and doff PPE or personal protective equipment. So I'm going to step down from my stool here and show you what we do on the wards. So the first thing we do is we grab a gown. I, of course, disinfect my hands prior to all this. Takes a little dexterity to tie all of these ties in the back. Next, we take our N95 mask, which we've been fit tested, meaning that we know it's a right fit for us. And we pull it over our nose. We make sure it fits. We breathe to make sure it fits our face appropriately. And we take either a set of goggles then we take a set of goggles or a face shield. Fit it over here. And then our last thing is to put on the gloves. Now this particular set of gowns has cuffs, which is a nice little addition. So here we are. Now we're ready to take care of the patient. Okay. So this is how we look. How do you work in this thing? How do our patients feel? So I'm going to take this off now so that you can hear me better, but I'm feeling really hot in this gown. I'm sweating underneath, and I feel like I can barely see you through this thing, and I'm supposed to comfort you. Okay. This is not easy. All right, so I'm going to doff all of this stuff, which actually has its own set of procedures so that you don't contaminate yourself. So I'm going to step down and doff. Then, of course, I would disinfect my hands several times along the way. So, frankly, looking at us in this getup, I feel like we look like lepers ourselves. We feel totally disconnected from our patients. We sometimes talk to them through the one-touch computer system, but people are dying alone. They're so sick, and we really have nothing so much to offer. We were learning on the fly. How can we comfort those that we cannot touch? How do we deal with this at home? Can we take off our masks at home with those closest to us? After all, we need some semblance of intimacy, after all, to get us through this. And yet again, our faith shows us a path. When our medical and technical skills are lacking, we still keep on going. We learned to band together. We ran conferences about the latest data. We shared our personal experiences of our patients. Hey, when do you think we should use steroids, even before the randomized controlled trials were out? Does hydroxychloroquine really work? Remember all of that confusion. We had some hope and we tried to use an immunomodulator, an IL-6 inhibitor, a monoclonal antibody, and yeah, people seemed like they were getting better. We shared our x-rays, our anecdotes. We talked through Zoom. Our nurses and doctors went to great lengths to comfort those who were dying without family. Our own internal medicine department met daily to put processes in place to make sure we could do our work. We engaged in research, clinical trials, to try to understand an unfolding disease in real time. We rejoiced when our patients would get discharged. And we did become better at what we were doing. We had better use of oxygen delivery techniques so that people would not end up on the ventilator. We implemented antivirals like remdesivir. We started learning how to use steroids at the right time. Our length of stay got better, as did our mortality rate. And yet, we're bracing into another scary phase here in the fall and into the winter. Will our numbers get as high as the first round? So much uncertainty. Where will this end? Are we ready? Are we too tired to be ready? Are our new tools enough to shepherd us through? HIV took decades to get under control. But yet with COVID, actually, we've made remarkable progress in just 9 months, believe it or not. And this again is where our faith anchors us. I read in Father Ryan's reflections, his running reflections, his quote from Romans 5. Hope does not disappoint. I think that within my own career, I've lived through the AIDS epidemic, where early on, we only had hope to hang on to. But with time, we found a way. So now with this pandemic, we all play our part. I am one lone physician who tries to do what I know best, use my training to advocate for my patients, and heal when I can, doing the best that I can with what we have now. But there's so many others that are part of this journey of hope. Vaccine researchers, makers of therapeutics, public health advocates, local, federal government, and everyone who does their part by masking and socially distancing even when it is tough. And I have to say now, after the election, we have the hope of new leadership which will re-empower our great institutions, such as the Centers for Disease Control, so that we can have guidance that is wise and consistent. So hope is not just a wish. It is built on our communal work. We do it together. We do it walking in faith. During this time of uncertainty, it is comforting to know that even if we cannot see it now, there is a path forward, because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts through the Holy Spirit, which was given to us. And yes, hope does not disappoint. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Villanueva, for your insights on your own faith, on the dignity of each person, and on hope. I'm just wondering, as you're dealing with these diseases, especially HIV and AIDS, when it was early on and not a lot was known, as well as now with COVID, how do you face your own fears of getting sick, or how that might impact your family? What are the things you need to do to keep energized, to keep doing the work?
You know that's somehow that doesn't really enter so much into my consciousness. Not that I am heedless or that I'm careless in any shape, way, or form. And I know the risks. But Peter reminded me, like when the firemen went into 9/11, to the burning building, there were these, 300 plus firefighters. They went in and they did their job. You don't know what's going to happen, but you're training, you do your job, and you have faith that hopefully things will turn out well. It may not turn out well, and that's a reality. I don't actually think that scares me. I think that you take the appropriate precautions, and this is part of one's calling. So I guess I'm not really that afraid. I think that many of my colleagues, they are afraid, but I think that the majority of people feel like if anyone is ready to do this, it's us who have been trained, and we are the vanguard. So I guess I'm not that scared.
We have a couple of questions on the medical side. So why do you think so much progress has been made on COVID-19 so quickly?
Well, for one thing, compared to where we were in 1981 when HIV first came along, our technologies are so much more advanced. I remember with HIV, 1981 were the first cases that were reported in the MMWR. We really didn't even know it was a virus for several years later. We didn't have any tests to actually make the diagnosis. We didn't have our first therapeutic for 4 to 5 years. And that was just the pace of biotechnical discovery. I think our techniques are so much more advanced now that China knew, within a week, basically, that we were dealing with a coronavirus. Okay, and our pharmaceutical companies are just so much more equipped to do much larger scale testing. There are all these other, like remdesivir was an antiviral that had been already looked into for Ebola, so it was already on the shelf. So it's not like they were starting entirely from scratch. And people are just in our technical spheres are just much more savvy. So how are things proceeding quickly, too? I think another really key thing is that the world and the various spheres involved in COVID-19 are so much more interconnected. Someone does, for better or for worse, someone does a trial in France, and then boom, there are these articles now that come out into a preprint journal called medRxiv, so that, in fact, people get things out there so much more quickly than they did before. And so everyone is just much more aware because the social media and the usual channels that we have do get information out there much more quickly. So I think that between technology, information sharing, I just know, like, even within the hospital, people I know in the infectious disease field, you're on everybody's Twitter feeds, right? Everyone is knowing this is what we did in San Francisco. Mass General, what is your protocol? And we just share this amount of stuff in real time. So I do think that these things do make the pace of knowledge and pace of clinical care delivery, for better or for worse. Sometimes we go too fast because, we don't know what is the best thing. But I think in general, this sort of excitement, the intensity of discovery, the intensity of sharing information just moves the field along in ways that were never before conceivable. In terms of just the vaccine development, I can tell you that this vaccine that Pfizer is putting out is a brand new technology that people had not even utilized before. It's an mRNA vaccine, and this technology had been speculated about, but people were ready. This was already nothing that hadn't been thought about, but the different advantages of this technology, people were right on it. And then competition across the world. I just think there's just such a wealth of expertise and intelligence within the medical and the public health community and everywhere that is just global.
So this is a question on the faculty side. Listening to patients and taking time to uphold the dignity, it takes time and skill that is not part of your kind of standard medical training, right? So how do you teach those skills to medical students?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fast pace at which we go also makes it more difficult for us to slow down and have these conversations. I would say that at Yale, we do instill this into the curriculum. We are very, at Yale New Haven Hospital, I'm happy to say that there's a whole group called the patient experience. People are very much more tuned into what does it feel like to be the patient. And I do think that messaging this to our students and our trainees is incredibly important. And I already see changes. I see that when I work with the house staff, I work with the medical students, I said, wow, these guys are so empathic. It's like, I feel like in my generation, we were like just moving so quickly through everything. And they value it. And that's a huge step in the right direction. Having said that, the pace of our medical wards, our work is incredibly fast, and the number of tests we're on Epic. I mean, the amount of medical information we have to process, plus all of the demands in terms of the logistics of getting our work done. They're not trivial. They're absolutely not trivial. And in these days when, I can tell you that the pressure is mounting within the hospital as our census goes up every single day with COVID, it's everyone is like in hyperdrive. So when you're in that situation, how do you take the time to talk to your patient? I just think that you have to make a concerted effort, and you don't need hours and hours upon. I think that patients just appreciate the fact that you connect with them as a patient, as a person. I was just on the wards today. I was seeing a patient, just as an example, a guy who had been transferred to our hospital from another hospital. And, the nurses, it didn't take so much time, but, I would say 5 minutes, 7 minutes, we just sort of tune into something, get a sense of where they're at emotionally, where they're at with their lives. I personally always like to ask people where they're from. So what do you like to do? Those kinds of things. It doesn't take a long time, but it makes that connection. And then this patient was like, wow, you guys here at Yale, you're so kind. I feel better already. I know that sounds very, maybe too Pollyanna-ish, but it's true. When people feel sick, someone just asks a personal thing and just tunes into them, they're like better. So our students and our faculty, I think they're getting better at it, but I think it devolves to each and every healthcare worker. If you don't prioritize that, it's just not going to happen.
So back to the medical side, you talked about how you and your colleagues band together during this certain time. Can you just give some examples of that, or what does that feel like to support each other that way?
So there's lots of different ways to support one another. I think that and it's paradoxically, there's something about an outbreak, and this happened in the early days of HIV/AIDS too, where everyone is just learning together. There's like the textbook has not been written, and it's exciting actually. It's like people are they're just in learning mode, and they just band together. So as an example, I remember early on the 9th floor when we were getting all the cases. So my ward was the first COVID ward, and we just didn't know what was going to come our way. And so, a group of us from the people in pharmacy and therapeutics, they were writing the algorithms. We would meet with among ourselves, and we would just on the computer in a conference room and said, hey, patient number 1, it's like, look at this chest x-ray. What do you think this is? What do you think is the pathophysiology? Have you ever seen anything like this? And people would just chime in, and then as the cases, we would record them. It says, remember case number 4, that I did this in case number 4. And then said, hey, did you read this article? It was just, so we banded together sheerly over learning how to take care of the patients. On another level, on a more sort of administrative and logistic level, our department, I have to say, our department chair, Dr. Desir, internal medicine at Yale School of Medicine, just united us all. So we would meet every single day from 9 to 10, and we would just share the stories, of what was happening all over the hospital. So we would just tune in, and we just felt like we knew what we were all doing, all the trends, things that would go well, things that would not go well. We would argue, we would cajole, we would just try to figure things out. But through it all, we just built this camaraderie, and that was supportive too. But other things, people would come up with ideas, like the palliative care team would say, we're going to create a whole service just because our older patients who their families can't come, we're just going to create a service for them. And we really would call families, we would tune in with them and have really difficult conversations with our palliative care colleagues guiding us. So we actually would give people a dignified death, or we would be part of that. And so I think there were lots of different pockets. People get creative when things are tough. I was amazed. The stories of creativity everywhere, from people in engineering, figuring out a way to take a ventilator and then hook it up so that more than one person can actually use the ventilator. That's like an engineering thing. It's like, whoa, that is really cool. I would never have thought of that, but I'm so glad there's people in engineering who know how to do that. So we all took what we could do, but everyone was really focused and innovative and creative. So despite all the fear, it's a really special time. I tell my medical students this is that, you are living through an incredibly unique time in medical history. And when you look back on it, you will realize how particularly challenging and energizing this was.
So I think one of the challenges as people of faith is that all of your standard outlets for prayer and worship are restricted due to COVID. I'm wondering, how do you deal with that in your own life, especially for those first several months when there really was almost a complete lockdown?
I tell you, it's been rough. You realize that, you so depend on coming together in a location to pray with people, to eat with people, to just share with people. And that's as important, even more important now when we're deprived of it. But in terms of our faith life, I do think I'm very fortunate that, so my husband is also part of this community. He's a physician too. So that in itself is very, nurturing. And we attend the 10 a.m. Live streams together. The good news is we can go running and say, okay, let's get back for 10. And we tune into the live stream, and it's good. It's not the same, but it's still very healing. I think we just have the hope that we'll be back together soon. But even having this opportunity to speak, I don't see you guys out there, but I feel like you guys are going to listen to me, and people that I've known for so many years in so many different walks of life. I just feel that there is a communion there, and we just gotta just keep holding on.
So maybe on the more frivolous side, do you ever watch any of the medical dramas, and what's your reaction? Do you groan? Do you love them? Is it pure entertainment?
My kids will always say, I am the most non-TV person ever. I still have trouble working the remotes. That's because I hardly ever watch any of these. But occasionally when I watch some of these, they're not bad. I just feel like it's overly simplified. But if it gets people interested in medicine, what's wrong with that? But in general, I think that, they make it seem like everything is such a slam dunk. It's really not.
So maybe for the last question, just for any students who are thinking about medicine as a career, who are also Catholic, what's your advice to them? What do they need to know going into this, or what's going to help them work in a field where obviously we have lots of Catholics who are doctors in this community, but it's not always an easy walk between faith and science.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think this is an incredibly rewarding career. And I feel so fortunate to be in this profession. And this is really a real opportunity to take one's knowledge of science and bring it to come to bear in a very practical realm. I don't think there's too many other professions which give you this opportunity where you can really see people at their most vulnerable. You really see people when they're naked, frankly, you know. And it's like, how do you balance the science where I look at people and I have my medical knowledge, and yet I have to be able to translate that into something that will make this person better. So there's a very primal part of that, because we're laying hands on people, seeing people at their most vulnerable. So I think that if you like that kind of environment, medicine is a great field. There's so many different ways you can make a career in medicine. You don't have to be a clinician. You can work in public health. You can work in research. You can work in advocacy. You can be more of a teacher. You can do all of the above. I mean, I just think that as a field, the driving force in medicine of the fundamental principle of making people better in a global way is spawns so many different ways of looking at things. And so I do think that that's very rewarding, because you can find your place in this field. You don't have to major in anything particular. You don't have to major in science. So we have a lot of people who major in philosophy, in English, history, and they find their place in medicine. So, and I do think that, where the faith comes in is that eventually, you may come in, and I see this with young people. I'm not, knocking the energy and the energy and the enthusiasm of our young people, and it's great. Believe me, I love working with the students and the residents, but sometimes we get deluded into thinking that it's only our knowledge and our wherewithal that's going to turn the tide. And as you move more into this field, you realize how much we really can't ultimately change the trajectory of some things. And that's really where faith comes in, because you could throw up your hands and say, oh gosh, now what? This is really discouraging. But that's not the way to go. I do think that that's where the faith comes in, is that you may feel like your back is up against the wall, but you also feel like other people and God has your back, and that, like I said, with the hope. So I do think that if these kinds of ideas, this kind of sentiment resonates with you, then and that you don't make things better on a dime. Things just things take a while to improve. If that kind of thing is something that resonates with you, this is a great field. It's really, at the end of the day, it's more than a profession. I think if you make it, and that's where the faith part comes in, you recognize you're humble, then it's a calling. It's really a calling. I think that was the first question you asked. How come you're not afraid? It's because this is a calling. And what makes it a calling is that it's more than just, I'm just going to check off the boxes and order all the right tests and all that. It's just, I'm going to heal, I'm going to touch. And the role model is Jesus, who did that before us. And so that's what keeps us going.
Thank you so much, Dr. Villanueva, and thank you all for joining us tonight. This was our final lecture for the fall semester, and we look forward to having you join us again in the spring. Have a safe and blessed Thanksgiving and Christmas. Good night, everyone.